The lights of the massive international studio glared down on the polished floor. Cameras whirred softly, capturing every detail for millions watching around the world. Leaders from Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas sat in a perfect semicircle, flags behind them glowing under bright spotlights. Donald Trump leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his red tie, his eyes narrowing toward the African delegation. His voice cut through the room like a blade. This United African Passport idea, it's garbage, absolute garbage. The words hit the air like an explosion. A sharp gasp echoed from the audience. Someone in the back dropped a pen. The translator's voice faltered mid-sentence. Trump smirked, enjoying the shock, his fingers drumming on the table. Why would anyone, in their right mind, think this could work? The camera panned to Captain Ibrahim Traoré, seated a few chairs away, his face calm but unreadable. The insult hung heavy in the air. And then, slowly, Barack Obama began to rise from his seat. The studio held its breath. Obama's movements were deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and took a single step forward. The studio lights caught his face. Calm, steady, but with a fire burning behind his eyes. The kind of fire that comes from truth, that refuses to stay silent. Donald, he began softly. The microphones picked up every syllable. Even the sound of someone shifting in their seat felt too loud. Trump leaned back, smirking again, but his eyes flickered, just for a second. Obama glanced briefly toward Ibrahim Traoré, giving him a small nod of acknowledgement. Then he looked directly at Trump. When you call something garbage without understanding its purpose, you're not just disrespecting an idea, Obama said, his voice tightening. You're disrespecting the people who believe in it, and the millions who would benefit from it. Trump opened his mouth to reply, but Obama raised a single finger, not to silence, but to hold the moment still. The audience leaned forward. The tension was unbearable. Cameras zoomed in. The next words would change everything. Obama's voice lowered, but somehow felt louder than the studio lights themselves. Do you know why the United African Passport matters? Trump stayed silent, his jaw tightening. It matters, Obama continued, because for too long, African leaders have been told by outside powers what they can and cannot do. Borders have been used as chains, not as bridges. The passport is not just paper. It is freedom. It is dignity. It is unity. The camera caught Ibrahim Traoré's face. Still calm, but his eyes shimmered. It wasn't just about travel documents. It was about centuries of struggle. Obama stepped closer to Trump, but kept his tone even. And here's the truth you might not want to hear. The world fears an Africa that moves as one, because an Africa united is an Africa unstoppable. Gasps broke out again. Some clapped before remembering they were live. Trump looked away for the first time, shifting in his seat. The world was watching, and they could feel that something historic had just begun. The moment Obama mentioned Africa's unity, the camera director, somewhere high above in the control booth, made a decision. Camera 2, a voice crackled over the headset. On the big screen in the studio, the feed switched to a close-up of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He sat still, but the quiet power in his presence seemed louder than any speech. His eyes didn't flinch. His posture was perfect, steady, as if centuries of African history sat on his shoulders. For a few seconds, nothing was said, and yet the silence spoke volumes. An elderly African leader, 2 rows behind Ibrahim, bowed his head, his lips trembling. Someone in the audience wiped away a tear. Even viewers at home could feel it. This was no longer just a debate. This was a moment of truth. Trump looked toward Ibrahim briefly, almost as if challenging him to speak. But Ibrahim didn't move. He simply looked back, his expression unshaken, and that stillness was more powerful than any words. Obama turned back to Trump, but his voice carried across the entire room. "Donald," he said, "do you remember the last time a whole continent was told its dreams were garbage? It was when African nations first demanded independence." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every sentence landed like a hammer. For decades, passports controlled by others kept Africans divided, kept farmers from selling across borders, kept students from studying in their own neighboring countries. It was never about security. It was about control. Obama paused, letting the words breathe. The camera caught Ibrahim nodding once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming each truth. "Now imagine," Obama continued, "a young woman in Burkina Faso, holding a single passport that lets her study in Ghana, work in Kenya, and visit family in Senegal without being treated like a stranger in her own land. Imagine telling her that freedom is garbage." The studio went utterly silent. Trump shifted again. But this time, his smirk was gone. It started with one clap, then another. Then, like a slow wave, applause began to ripple through the audience. Not wild cheering, but the kind of steady, respectful clapping reserved for truth that can't be ignored. Obama didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stepped back, allowing the weight of his words to hang in the air. Trump's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He leaned toward his microphone, clearly ready to fire back. But before he could speak, an unexpected figure reached for the mic. Ibrahim Traoré. The studio froze. Even the sound operators stopped moving. This was the man many knew for his quiet strength. And when he spoke, people listened. He adjusted the mic slowly, his hand steady, his gaze sweeping the room. And with the calmness of a man who knew the truth didn't need shouting, he said, "Before I speak, I want to tell you a story." Ibrahim's voice was calm but carried the weight of memory. "When I was a boy," he began, "my uncle tried to take me to visit my grandmother. She lived just across the border in Mali. It was less than 2 hours away." He paused, looking across the room, not at Trump, but at the people who understood. "But when we reached the checkpoint, the soldiers there refused us. They took our papers, looked at our faces, and told us we needed a special permit. My uncle had none. We turned back. I never saw my grandmother again. She died the next year." The room was utterly still. The audience didn't just hear him. They felt him. "I was 8 years old," Ibrahim continued, "and I could not understand why a piece of paper could stop me from hugging my own blood." He looked straight at Trump now, his voice firm. "That is why a united African passport is not just an idea. It is a promise that no child should be kept from family by a line drawn on a map." Somewhere in the audience, a woman sniffled. A man in a dark suit wiped his eyes. The cameraman instinctively zoomed in on faces, one after another, each showing the same thing: pain mixed with respect. Ibrahim didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Borders have been used to divide us for generations. They were not drawn by our ancestors. They were drawn in rooms far from Africa, by people who never knew our lands, our families, or our dreams." Obama sat back, watching, a small nod confirming he knew exactly where Ibrahim was going. "And today," Ibrahim said, "you may think you're speaking about a document. But what you are speaking about is the right of my people to live without barriers that were never ours to begin with." Trump crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing, but his body leaned back, the posture of someone on defense. The audience didn't clap this time. They didn't need to. The silence was louder than any applause. Ibrahim took a breath. "Let me tell you about another child I met last year in Ouagadougou's market," he said. He described a little girl no older than 7 selling mangoes under the hot sun. Her family was from Niger, but her parents couldn't get work permits because their documents weren't recognized across the border. She She should have been in school, Ibrahim said softly. But instead she was carrying baskets twice her size, just to buy a little food. And when I asked her what she wanted most in the world, do you know what she said? He let the question hang. The audience leaned forward. She said, "I want to see the sea." A murmur swept through the studio. She had never left her city. She didn't even know what the ocean looked like. A United African passport could have opened her world. But right now, the walls are too high. His voice hardened. That little girl's dream is worth more than your insult. The air felt electric. Ibrahim's voice slowed. In my office back in Ouagadougou, he said, there's a chair in the corner. I never move it. It's for my father. The audience leaned in. My father died when I was young. He wanted to start a transport company, to connect West African countries so goods could move freely. But every time he tried to cross borders, he was stopped. Paperwork, permits, delays that cost him everything. Ibrahim's gaze swept the room. The day he died, he was sitting at a checkpoint, waiting for a clearance stamp. He never made it home. That chair in my office stays empty to remind me. Our people have paid for these borders with their lives. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her cheeks. Even the translators' voices trembled as they repeated his words. Ibrahim took a breath. You call our passport garbage? I call it my father's dream. Trump looked away, the weight of the words beginning to land. Before the silence could fade, Obama leaned forward again. Donald, he said, you might think this is politics, but what you're hearing is pain. What you're hearing is history. Obama turned toward the audience, his voice carrying with quiet power. This passport is not about open borders for chaos. It's about open doors for hope. It's about a farmer in Uganda selling to Nigeria without losing half his earnings to fees. It's about a child in Malawi visiting the pyramids in Egypt without being treated like an outsider. The crowd began nodding, the energy shifting. Cameras zoomed in on Trump, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Obama's voice sharpened just enough to cut. If your family had been kept apart by walls someone else built, you wouldn't be laughing at this. The room erupted in murmurs. Trump's eyes narrowed, but for the first time all night, he didn't speak. Ibrahim lifted his mic again. Last year, I visited a border crossing between Burkina Faso and Ivory Coast. There, I met a young man named Musa. He was standing under the sun with a bag of books in his hand. The audience was silent. He told me he'd been accepted into a university in Abidjan, but he had been stuck at that border for 3 days. His papers weren't enough. He didn't have the money for processing fees, so he slept on the roadside. Ibrahim's voice tightened. Musa's dream was to become a doctor. How many patients will die in the future because he was kept waiting? How much talent have we lost to walls that serve no purpose but to keep us apart? Somewhere in the audience, a young African student in the crowd began crying openly. Ibrahim looked at Trump. His words were measured, but unshakable. Do not tell me our passport is garbage. Tell me why you fear it. The air was thick, and the cameras caught every breath. Ibrahim's tone softened. A few months ago, I visited a refugee camp near our northern border. There I met a mother named Awa. She had walked for days with her 2 children, trying to cross into safety. He paused, his eyes heavy. She told me she had been stopped at 3 different checkpoints. Each one demanded papers she didn't have. Each time she was turned back. The audience was silent. I asked her what was hardest. She didn't say hunger. She didn't say fear. She said it was the look on her children's faces when soldiers told them they could not pass. Some in the front row reached for tissues. A United African passport, Ibrahim said, is not just for the privileged. It is for mothers like Awa, who should not have to beg for the right to protect their children. He glanced at Trump, but there was no anger, only sadness. Call it garbage if you wish, but her tears were more real than your laughter. The studio's atmosphere began to change. You could almost hear hearts breaking. Trump, once leaning back with confidence, now shifted uneasily. His hands fidgeted, his jaw clenched. Obama leaned slightly toward Ibrahim, as if encouraging him to go on. Ibrahim continued, but this time he spoke not to Trump, but to the millions watching at home. Africa is not asking for permission to unite. We are not asking for validation from anyone. We are simply claiming what was always ours, the freedom to move, to trade, to learn, to live, without walls built by those who never lived here. The audience began nodding in unison. A few leaders even clapped despite the formal setting. Cameras swept across the room, capturing faces. A Nigerian diplomat's tear, a South African journalist pressing her lips together, a young Ghanaian student wiping his eyes. Trump tried to cut in, but the applause was already drowning him out. When the room quieted, Ibrahim leaned into his microphone, his voice steady. "Mr. Trump," he said slowly, "do you know what it feels like to be treated as a stranger on your own continent?" Trump didn't answer. "I do," Ibrahim continued, "and so do millions of Africans. We carry passports that mean little at our own borders. We are asked for proof of who we are in the land of our ancestors, and if we cannot provide it, we are told to turn back, as if we don't belong." His words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. This is why we fight for the United African Passport, not to erase nations, but to erase the walls that were never meant to be there in the first place. Ibrahim looked around the room, his gaze strong yet calm. Because until those walls fall, Africa will never truly be free. The studio was silent. Trump's face was pale, and the world was still watching. The studio was silent, except for the faint hum of the cameras. Donald Trump's smirk had faded hours ago, but he sat stiffly, gripping the arms of his chair. The United African Passport debate had dragged on, but everyone knew the air was thick with something bigger: pride, dignity, and the weight of history. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who had remained quiet through most of the chaos, finally leaned forward. His voice was soft, almost fragile, but it carried like thunder. "You call it garbage," he said, looking straight at Trump. "But you forget. Passports do not carry dirt. They carry dreams." Every leader in the room shifted. It wasn't just a clapback. It was a reminder, a memory, a truth. Traoré told a story of a young African boy stopped at a foreign airport, treated like a criminal for the color of his skin. The boy had asked his father, "Why does my paper not open the same doors as theirs?" Trump shifted uncomfortably. Cameras caught the flicker in his eyes. Traoré ended with a whisper. "This passport is not just a book. It's a promise." And the promise suddenly felt bigger than politics. The weight of Traoré's words hung in the air. Then, Barack Obama stood, his expression calm but razor-sharp. "Donald," he said, his voice measured, "there are moments in history when you can choose to be remembered as a builder, or as the one who mocked the builders." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "When you laugh at a United African Passport, you're not laughing at paper. You're laughing at unity. At mothers who will no longer have to watch their sons be turned away at foreign borders. At fathers who dream their children can travel without shame." The silence was deafening. Obama leaned closer, his voice lower but sharper than glass. "Mocking unity is easy. Building it takes courage. Something I'm afraid you've never known." The audience gasped. Cameras zoomed in on Trump's tightened jaw, the beads of sweat on his forehead. Obama didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His final line cut deeper than any shout. History won't remember your insults. It will remember the day you got silenced. And at that moment the room erupted. The clapping began slowly, one pair of hands from the back row, then another. Then the sound swelled until it was a storm. People rose to their feet, the applause crashing against the studio walls. Ibrahim Traoré and Barack Obama exchanged a brief nod. No words, just the shared understanding of two men who had stood for something bigger than themselves. Trump sat frozen. For the first time all night he had no comeback. The cameras caught tears in the eyes of several leaders. The United African passport, once mocked, was now spoken of with reverence. In living rooms across the globe, people felt something stir. Hope. Traoré raised his head and looked into the camera. To every African child watching, know this. Your value is not decided by the stamp in your passport, but by the strength in your heart. But together, we will make sure both match. The broadcast ended, but the world was already talking. If this moment moved you, if you felt proud, angry, or hopeful, don't just scroll away. Hit like so this message reaches the world. Subscribe so you never miss a story that speaks truth to power. And tell me in the comments, what does unity mean to you? Your words matter here. Your voice is part of this history.